In the heart of Manhattan's bustling business district, a self-made millionaire, Ethan Carter, sat in his glass-walled office on the 50th floor of a gleaming skyscraper. Outside, the skyline sparkled with the city's vibrant energy, but Ethan focused elsewhere. His attention lingered on his phone screen, where the word "Mom" flashed persistently, breaking his concentration. The deal of his career, months of meticulous planning, was within reach, but this call threatened to derail everything. Reluctantly, Ethan answered, already bracing himself for the inevitable. "Ethan, sweetheart." His mother's voice was warm, yet carried a tinge of exasperation. "We need to talk about your life." A familiar pang of guilt tugged at him. This wasn't about business. It was about something far more personal, a subject Ethan had long avoided. He had buried himself in his work for years, building an empire from nothing. But to his parents, his relentless drive for success wasn't enough. "Ethan, happiness isn't found in boardrooms or profit margins," his mother had once said. "It's in the people you share your life with." This time, however, the stakes were different. His parents, Amelia and Daniel Carter, had planned a long-anticipated world tour to celebrate their retirement. But now, his mother had decided they couldn't leave while their only son remained single and, in her words, unfulfilled. They intended to postpone their plans unless Ethan could prove otherwise, staying close to help him find happiness. Ethan knew what this meant. Weeks of interference, unsolicited advice, and countless blind dates with women who didn't know the first thing about him. But even more pressing, this parental intervention risked distracting him from a deal that could redefine his career. He couldn't let that happen. "Mom, I've already found someone," Ethan said suddenly, the words leaving his mouth before he could think them through. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by his mother's delighted shriek. His stomach sank as the weight of his own words settled over him. Now, he had no choice but to deliver on his lie. What would he do next? Who could he find to play the role of a fiancé, convincing enough to fool his sharp-eyed mother and charismatic father? And how far would this web of deception stretch before it unraveled? Sometimes, life's greatest surprises emerge from the most unexpected decisions. Ethan Carter's seemingly simple solution would set off a chain of events that would change not only his life, but also the life of someone he had yet to meet. Stay tuned as we dive into a story of love, lies, and the power of unexpected connections. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of transformation, mystery, and the pursuit of happiness. Ethan sat motionless, his mother's delighted shrieks echoing in his ears, making him wish he could take back his words. "Ethan," Amelia exclaimed, "why didn't you tell us sooner? This is wonderful news. Your father and I must meet her tomorrow night." "No excuses. Tomorrow," Ethan repeated, his voice betraying his panic. His mother, as always, was decisive and impossible to dissuade. "Yes, tomorrow," she said with finality. "We'll have dinner at Lou Jardin. It's been too long since we all celebrated together. Oh, and your godmother, Sophia, will be joining us. She's in town, and you know how she's been hoping for this moment for years." Ethan's heart sank further. His godmother, sharp and intuitive, had always seen through his half-truths as though she could peer directly into his soul. If there was anyone who could unravel, his was her. "Mom, my godmother, we should," he began, but Amelia interrupted him firmly. "No arguments, Ethan. This is the happiest news we've had in years. Tomorrow night, 7 sharp. Bring your fiancé." As the call ended, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the sleek skyline of Manhattan. The weight of his lie pressed heavily on him. He had only 24 hours to conjure up the perfect fiancé, someone polished enough to convince his discerning parents and godmother, yet detached sufficiently to disappear once the ruse was over. Where could he possibly find someone in time? His assistant, Olivia, entered the room, her silent grace always surprising him. She carried her tablet, ready to tackle the day's schedule, unaware of the storm brewing in Ethan's mind. "Olivia," he said, his voice tinged with desperation, "I need your help with something personal." Olivia arched a brow. "Personal?" she asked cautiously. Ethan hesitated before explaining his predicament, detailing the impossible dinner, his mother's expectations, and his offhand lie about a fiancé. Olivia listened, her professional demeanor unchanging, until Ethan finally made his plea. I need you to pretend to be my fiancé. Just for tomorrow. Olivia's professional mask cracked for the first time in years, and she looked genuine pleaded. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice carefully measured. I've worked for you for 3 years. I've handled crises, coordinated multimillion-dollar deals, and even rescheduled Christmas for you. But this? Pretending to be your fiancé crosses a line. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the situation's futility. Please, Olivia. I'll make it worth your while. You're the only one who knows me well enough to pull this off. She stood, her expression softening slightly. Ethan, you've always been a fair boss, but this is a deception I can't be part of. You'll figure something out. You always do. If you'll excuse me, I have real work to handle. As Olivia left, Ethan slumped in his chair, the enormity of his task sinking in. Where could he find someone willing to step into this role quickly? Someone believable, yet with no ties to his life? The thought seemed absurd, impossible. That was until later that evening when fate intervened in the unlikeliest ways. It was nearly 10 p.m. when Ethan left the office, his mind a whirlwind of failed ideas and growing panic. The underground parking garage was dimly lit and eerily quiet, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. Lost in thought, he climbed into his sleek black Mercedes and pulled out of his reserved space. As he turned a corner, a figure darted out from between 2 parked cars. His foot slammed on the brake, but not fast enough. There was a soft thud, followed by a startled cry. Heart pounding, Ethan threw the car into the park and jumped out. Are you okay? He asked, his voice alarmingly tight. On the ground was a young woman, her clothes shabby and her appearance disheveled, but her green eyes, shining with a mixture of anger and pain, were unforgettable. What kind of person drives like that in a parking garage? She snapped, wincing as she examined her scraped knee. I was only going about 20, Ethan stammered, realizing how ridiculous he sounded. Here, let me help you. She ignored his outstretched hand and stood on her own, brushing off her torn jeans. 20 in a parking garage is still too fast, she said, her voice sharp but her tone dignified. You're right, Ethan said, his voice softening. I'm sorry. Please, let me take you to the hospital to get checked out. No hospitals, she said firmly. I'm fine. Ethan studied her more closely now. Though her clothes were clearly worn and her circumstances dire, there was an unmistakable air of strength and grace about her. Something about her, despite her ragged exterior, captivated then. An idea, a wild, improbable, most brutal idea, began to form. What's your name? Gently. She hesitated, debating whether to answer, before finally saying, Claire. Well, Claire, Ethan began, carefully choosing his words. Would you let me take you to dinner instead? There's a cafe around the corner. My treat. I'd like to make up for almost running you over. Claire's green eyes narrowed suspiciously. I'm not that kind of girl. Ethan's cheeks flushed. No, nothing like that, he said quickly. I have a business proposition that might interest you. Completely legitimate. Just hear me out. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his tailored suit, expensive watch, and luxury car. Finally, she relented. Fine, she said, her tone guarded. But we sit by the window, and you keep your hands where I can see them. Deal, Ethan said, exhaling in relief. The cafe was nearly empty, its quiet warmth starkly contrasted with the sterile parking garage. As promised, they sat by the window, and Ethan ordered coffee for both. Claire sat stiffly, her defensive posture still graceful, as though bracing herself for disappointment. So, she said finally, breaking the silence, what's this proposition? Ethan hesitated, knowing how absurd his request would sound. I need someone to pretend to be my fiancé. Just for a few weeks. Claire blinked, clearly taken aback. Why would you need that? As Ethan explained his predicament, his parents' expectations, the looming dinner, and his accidental lie, Claire listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she stirred her coffee thoughtfully before speaking. "And what makes you think I'm the right person for this?" she asked, calm but probing. Ethan leaned forward. "Because you're strong, you're dignified, and there's something about you. Something that tells me you could pull this off. I'll pay you well and help you with whatever you need." Claire studied him in silence, her green eyes unreadable. Finally, she said, "If I do this, I have conditions." "Name them," Ethan said without hesitation. "I want everything in writing," she said firmly. "And I want to know everything about you before I meet your family. No surprises." "Done," Ethan said, relief washing over him. Claire took a final sip of her coffee, her expression slightly softening. "All right," she said. "But don't think for a second that I'll make this easy for you." Ethan smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. For the first time all day, he felt like he might just pull this off. But as they left the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was only the beginning of something far more complicated and transformative than he could imagine. The following morning, Ethan's sleek Mercedes pulled up in front of a high-end boutique on Fifth Avenue. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her arms folded across her chest, her face betraying suspicion and discomfort. The transformation had begun, and Ethan knew this would be the first hurdle. "I still don't see why this is necessary," Claire muttered as she stepped out of the car, glancing nervously at the boutique's ornate glass doors. Ethan followed her, adjusting his cufflinks. "If you're going to convince my parents, you must look the part. Trust me, this isn't about appearances. It's about them believing the story." Claire hesitated at the entrance, her gaze shifting to the display of designer dresses that cost more than most people earned in a year. "I've survived years without anyone questioning my story, Ethan. I don't need expensive clothes to play a role." Ethan softened his tone, sensing her unease. "Claire, this isn't just about the clothes. It's about giving you the confidence to walk into that dinner and own the room. My parents are sharp, and they'll scrutinize every detail. This is about ensuring we succeed. Let me help." Reluctantly, Claire nodded and followed him inside. A stylist greeted them with practiced charm, quickly sizing up Claire's worn jeans and simple blouse. "We'll need a full makeover," the stylist declared, clapping her hands as an assistant appeared to take Claire's measurements. Over the next few hours, Claire endured a whirlwind of fittings, styling, and consultations. Ethan stayed close by, occasionally stepping in with suggestions or approving choices. As the stylists worked, Claire found herself watching Ethan with curiosity. For all his wealth and polished exterior, he seemed oddly invested in her comfort, as if this were more than just a transaction. When the transformation was complete, Claire stepped out of the dressing room in a fitted emerald green dress accentuating her striking green eyes. Her hair, now a cascade of soft waves, framed her face elegantly. She looked every inch the part of Ethan's sophisticated fiancée. Ethan stood speechless for a moment, his usual composure slipping. "You look incredible," he finally managed, his voice sincere. Claire rolled her eyes, though a faint blush rose to her cheeks. "It's just a dress." "It's not just the dress," Ethan said, his tone softer. "You carry yourself differently now. Confident. You're going to be amazing." For the first time, Claire allowed herself a small smile. "Let's hope your parents think so." When Ethan and Claire arrived at the restaurant, the sun had set, casting the city in a warm, golden glow. The valet opened the car door for Claire, and as she stepped out, heads turned. The emerald dress and understated yet elegant jewelry gave her an air of effortless grace. Even Ethan, accustomed to high society glamour, couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're staring again," Claire said softly, adjusting the small clutch in her hands. Ethan smiled, uncharacteristically flustered. "Sorry, I'm just proud. You'll be great." They entered the restaurant, where Amelia and Daniel Carter were already waiting, seated at a table near the window. As Ethan approached, his mother's eyes lit up, and she stood to greet them. "Ethan, and this must be..." "This is Claire," Ethan said, his hand lightly resting on Claire's back as he introduced her. "Claire, these are my parents, Amelia and Daniel." Amelia stepped forward, her eyes scanning Claire with delight and scrutiny. "It's wonderful to meet you, dear," she said, embracing Claire warmly. "You're even lovelier than Ethan described." Claire returned the embrace, her smile gracious but reserved. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Please, call me Amelia," she insisted. Daniel extended a hand, his firm grip and kind smile putting Claire at ease. "Welcome to the family, Claire," he said. Just as the initial introduction settled, a new voice joined the group. "Am I late?" Ethan's godmother, Sophia Blake, approached the table. She was an elegant woman in her late 50s, her piercing gaze and confident stride commanding attention. Ethan stiffened slightly, knowing her reputation for reading people like an open book. Sophia's sharp eyes shifted to Claire, and for a moment, she simply stared. "Well, aren't you full of surprises, Ethan?" she said, teasing but laced with curiosity. "Claire, this is my godmother, Sophia," Ethan said quickly. "Sophia, this is my fiancé." Sophia extended her hand, her smile warm but probing. "It's lovely to meet you, Claire. I can see why Ethan is so smitten." Claire met her gaze without flinching, shaking her hand firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, Sophia. Ethan's spoken so highly of you." The dinner began, and the conversation flowed easily at first. Claire navigated the questions about her background with practiced poise, sticking to the story Ethan had meticulously crafted with her. She spoke of their fictional meeting at a charity gala, her career as a freelance writer, and their shared love for the arts. But as the evening progressed, Sophia's questions became sharper, more probing. "You've lived in New York for how long?" she asked, her tone casual but her gaze intense. "About 3 years," Claire answered smoothly. "I moved here for work." "And your family? Where are they from?" Sophia's voice softened slightly, but the question hit a nerve. Claire hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around her wine glass. "My parents passed away when I was young," she said carefully. "I grew up in foster care." The table grew quiet for a moment, and Ethan quickly stepped in. "Claire doesn't like to dwell on the past," he said, his tone protective. "She's built an incredible life for herself, and that's what matters." Sophia didn't press further, but her sharp gaze lingered on Claire for a moment longer than necessary. Amelia, sensing the tension, redirected the conversation. "Ethan, you've always been so private about your relationships. It's wonderful to see you with someone who brings out the best in you." Ethan glanced at Claire, surprised to find himself agreeing with his mother. Despite the ruse, there was something about Claire that felt real. As the evening wound down, Amelia clasped Claire's hands warmly. "You're truly remarkable, Claire. I hope we'll see much more of you." Claire smiled, the warmth of Amelia's words catching her off guard. "Thank you, Amelia. That means a lot." But as they left the restaurant, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Sophia wasn't entirely convinced. Her probing questions and lingering looks suggested she sensed something more profound, something neither Ethan nor Claire fully understood. As they drove back to Ethan's penthouse, Claire stared out the window, lost in thought. "Your godmother doesn't miss much, does she?" she said. "No, she doesn't," Ethan admitted. "But you handled yourself perfectly." Claire's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thanks. I just hope I can keep this up." Ethan glanced at her, the city lights casting a soft glow on her face. "You'll do more than that," he said quietly. "You'll surprise everyone, including me." Neither of them realized just how prophetic those words would prove to be. Ethan paced his penthouse the following evening, his usual confidence replaced by a gnawing unease. The dinner had gone well, almost too well. His mother had adored Claire, and his father had approved of her grace, but his godmother Sophia lingered in his thoughts. Her sharp gaze, her probing questions. It was as though she sensed something beneath the surface. Claire, meanwhile, was in her room preparing for the second dinner. This one would be smaller, more intimate, a private gathering at the Carter family's estate. Ethan had insisted on reviewing their backstory again, but Claire had waved him off with a dismissive smile. "Relax," she'd said. "I've got this." As the car pulled into the circular driveway of the Carter estate, Claire felt a pang of awe. The sprawling mansion exuded old-world elegance with its grand columns and manicured gardens. She adjusted the hem of her midnight blue dress, her nerves threatening to bubble to the surface. Ethan noticed her hesitation and leaned closer. "Just breathe," he whispered. "You're perfect." Inside, the evening unfolded smoothly at first. Dinner was served in the family's private dining room, the table set with fine china and crystal. Amelia doted on Claire, asking about her writing and expressing genuine admiration for her resilience. Daniel shared stories of Ethan's childhood, much to Ethan's embarrassment. But Sophia, seated at the far end of the table, remained quiet, her gaze shifting between Claire and Ethan with unsettling intensity. When dessert was served, Sophia broke her silence. "Claire," she began, her voice calm yet deliberate, "you mentioned growing up in foster care. Do you know anything about your birth family?" Claire stiffened slightly, but managed to keep her expression composed. "No," she said softly. "I've never had any information about them." Sophia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Not even a name? A memory?" Claire hesitated. "Just fragments," she admitted. "Flashes of things I can't quite piece together." Sensing the tension, Amelia interjected, "Sophia, dear, let's not pry. Claire's done wonderfully on her own. That's what matters." But Sophia wasn't deterred. "Forgive me," she said, her gaze still fixed on Claire. "It's just, you remind me of someone I once knew." The words hung in the air, charged with an intensity that made everyone at the table pause. Claire felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Who?" she asked cautiously. Sophia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose from her chair and crossed the room to a small antique chest. She opened it carefully, retrieving an old photograph. Returning to the table, she placed it in front of Claire. The image showed a young girl, no older than 4, with striking green eyes and a crescent-shaped birthmark on her shoulder, just like Claire's. Claire stared at the photo, her breath catching in her throat. This can't be," she whispered. Sophia's voice trembled. "Her name was Sarah," she said. "My daughter. She was taken from me 20 years ago." The room fell silent, the weight of Sophia's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Ethan looked between Claire and the photo, his mind racing. "Claire, do you have a birthmark?" he asked softly. Claire's hand moved instinctively to her left shoulder. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she reached for Claire's hands. "You're her," she whispered. "You're my Sarah." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Sophia recounted the tragedy that had torn her life apart. A bitter custody battle, a desperate escape, and a car accident that had claimed her ex-husband's life. Sarah, presumed dead, had been declared lost forever. Yet Sophia had never stopped searching, clinging to the hope that her daughter was alive somewhere. Claire, meanwhile, grappled with a flood of emotions, disbelief, anger, and a strange sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Memories she had long buried began to surface. A warm smile, the sound of a lullaby, the faint scent of lavender. "I don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "If I was found, why didn't anyone tell you?" Sophia's hands tightened around Claire's. "The authorities believed you had died in the crash," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father, he was unstable. He took you, and when the accident happened, they assumed the worst." Ethan, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "The people who found you, who raised you, what were they like?" Claire hesitated, her jaw tightening. "They weren't my family," she said bitterly. "They were opportunists. They moved constantly, always staying one step ahead of the law. I ran away when I was 14. Sophia's tears fell freely now. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have found you sooner." As the evening stretched into the early hours, Claire and Sophia continued to piece together the fragments of their shared history. Amelia and Daniel watched quietly, their initial skepticism replaced by awe. Ethan, for his part, felt a strange mix of relief and regret. What had begun as a lie to protect his career had unraveled into a life-altering revelation. Finally, Claire turned to Sophia, her green eyes shimmering with emotion. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do I just stop being Claire?" Sophia smiled through her tears. You'll always be who you are. But if you want, you can be Sarah again. Claire. Sarah nodded slowly, her heart filled with a tentative hope she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. She had a family, a mother who had never stopped loving her. Ethan escorted Claire back to the penthouse later that night, the city quiet under the glow of the streetlights. Neither of them spoke until they were inside, the weight of the evening still heavy. Are you okay? Ethan asked softly. Claire turned to him, her expression unreadable. I don't know, she admitted. I feel like my whole life has been turned upside down. But I think I'm glad it happened. Ethan hesitated before speaking. You deserve this, he said finally. A chance to be part of something real. Claire smiled faintly. So do you, she said. Maybe this whole thing wasn't just about fooling your parents. Maybe it was about finding something you didn't know you needed. Ethan felt his chest tighten at her words, her insight cutting deeper than he expected. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. As Claire retired to her room, Ethan stood alone in the living room, staring at the city. He had started this charade to save himself from familial interference. Instead, it brought him face to face with truths he hadn't been ready to confront, feelings he could no longer ignore. The story was far from over. Both Ethan and Claire had wounds to heal and futures to redefine. But one thing was clear. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. In the days following the dinner, life for Ethan and Claire, now grappling with her identity as Sarah, took on an entirely new dimension. Sophia invited her to stay at the Carter estate, a gesture filled with warmth and hope for the future. But, despite her growing connection with Sophia, Claire chose to remain at Ethan's penthouse, needing time to process the overwhelming revelations. Ethan respected her choice, sensing that her independence was part of her identity. Their days became a careful dance of navigating personal boundaries and addressing the emotions they'd both buried for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline, Ethan found Claire sitting on the penthouse balcony. She was wrapped in a soft blanket, her gaze distant as she held a cup of tea. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Mind if I join you? He asked. She glanced up, a small smile playing on her lips. Sure. Ethan sat down, his thoughts swirling. How are you holding up? He asked after a moment. Claire sighed, her breath visible in the crisp evening air. It's strange, she admitted. For years, I've told myself I didn't need anyone and was fine alone. And now, I have a mother who loves me, a family I never thought I'd find. It's almost too much. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. You've been through more than anyone should have to face. But you don't have to go through it alone anymore. Claire turned to him, her green eyes shimmering with vulnerability. And you? Why do you keep helping me? You've already done more than enough. Ethan hesitated, the weight of her question settling over him. Because I see something in you, he said finally. Strength, resilience, and maybe, because helping you makes me feel like I'm finally doing something that matters. Her lips curved into a faint smile, the tension between them easing. Thank you, she said softly. They sat silently for a while, the city lights twinkling below them. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to feel something she had long denied: hope. Claire and Sophia grew closer as the weeks passed, their bond deepening with each shared memory and heartfelt conversation. Sophia showed Claire the nursery she had never taken down, filled with toys and books from a life that had been stolen. The sight brought tears to Claire's eyes, but also solidified her decision to embrace her identity as Sarah, without losing the strength she had built as Claire. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself navigating a confusing mix of emotions. What had begun as a lie to appease his parents had become more profound. His admiration for Claire had deepened into respect, and that respect was slowly giving way to feelings he hadn't anticipated. One evening, Sophia pulled Ethan aside after another family dinner at the Carter estate. You've done something incredible for her, Sophia said, her voice filled with gratitude. You gave her the chance to find her family again. Ethan shook his head. She found you on her own. I just happened to be there. Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Do you care for her?" she asked gently. The question caught Ethan off guard. I don't know," he admitted. "She's been through so much. The last thing she needs is me complicating her life." "Or," Sophia countered, "you could be exactly what she needs." Ethan didn't respond, but Sophia's words lingered in his mind long after he returned to the penthouse. That night, as he watched Claire work on a writing project at the kitchen table, he saw her in a new light, not as someone he needed to save, but as someone he deeply admired. The next day, Ethan surprised Claire with an invitation. "I want to take you somewhere," he said, his tone casual but his eyes severe. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "You'll see," he said with a faint smile. They drove out of the city, leaving the skyscrapers behind for the quiet beauty of upstate New York. Ethan brought her to a sprawling park with winding trails and a serene lake. As they walked, Claire's guarded demeanor began to soften. "You didn't strike me as the outdoorsy type," she teased. Ethan laughed. "I'm not, usually, but I thought you might like the peace." They sat by the lake, the gentle water ripple creating a soothing backdrop. Ethan turned to Claire, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About us." Claire tensed slightly, her instincts warning her to tread carefully. "What about us?" Ethan hesitated, then took a deep breath. "This started as a lie," he admitted. "But somewhere along the way, it became real. I care about you, Claire, Sarah, and I want to see where this goes if you're willing." Claire's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty flashing across her face. For so long, she had lived with walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of loss and betrayal. But Ethan's sincerity was undeniable, and for the first time, she considered letting someone in. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly. "This is all still so new." Ethan nodded, his respect for her only deepening. "I understand. I'm not asking for anything right now. Just think about it." Claire smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Okay," she said softly. "I will." As they drove back to the city, the sun setting in a blaze of gold and crimson, they both felt a subtle shift in their connection. The lie that had brought them together was transforming into something tangible, something neither had anticipated, but both were beginning to hope for. In the days that followed their trip to the countryside, the bond between Ethan and Claire deepened. What had once been a transactional relationship now felt genuine, and both began to see each other in a new light. Yet, unspoken emotions hung between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. One evening, after another family dinner at the Carter estate, Ethan and Claire found themselves alone in the study. The room, lined with towering bookshelves and filled with the scent of aged leather, provided an intimate setting for a conversation neither could avoid much longer. Ethan stood near the fireplace, staring into the crackling flames as though searching for courage. Claire sat on a velvet armchair, her posture relaxed, and her eyes watched him closely. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've been quiet all evening. What's on your mind?" Ethan turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. "Something I've been avoiding." Claire tilted her head, intrigued but cautious. "I'm listening." He took a deep breath. "When I asked you to pretend to be my fiancé, it was to stop my parents from interfering with my life. I thought it was just a quick solution to buy me time." He paused, his voice faltering. But it stopped feeling like a lie somewhere along the way. Claire's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you," Ethan admitted, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. "Not because of what you've done for my family or because of the role you've played. I care about you, the person you are, the strength you've shown, the way you've faced everything life has thrown at you." Claire stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief and hope. "Ethan, I'm not asking for anything right now," he said quickly, sensing her hesitation. "I just needed you to know. Whatever happens next, I want you to make decisions that are right for you. Not because you feel obligated to me or anyone else." Claire looked away, her thoughts racing. For years, She had lived with walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of loss and betrayal. But Ethan's confession felt different. It wasn't a demand or an expectation. It was a gift freely given. Finally, she met his gaze, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being honest. I need time to process all of this, but I'm glad you told me." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. "Take all the time you need." As they parted ways that evening, both saw a shift in their relationship, a new level of trust and vulnerability that neither had anticipated but was beginning to embrace. The morning after their conversation, Claire woke early, her thoughts still swirling with Ethan's confession. She visited Sophia at the Carter estate, hoping for clarity and advice. Sophia greeted her warmly, ushering her into the sunlit sitting room where tea and pastries were already waiting. "You look like you have a lot on your mind," Sophia said, her perceptive gaze resting on Claire. "I do," Claire admitted, sitting down and wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. "Ethan told me something last night. Something that's made me question everything." Sophia smiled knowingly. "Let me guess. He finally admitted how he feels about you." Claire blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" Sophia chuckled softly. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way he defends you. Ethan has always been reserved when it comes to emotions, but with you, he's different." Claire hesitated, her voice quieter. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. My whole life has been about survival, not love." Sophia reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Claire's. "Sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, and sometimes it's exactly what we need to heal." As they spoke, a thought struck Claire. "Sophia," she began hesitantly, "I've been wondering something. When I was little, before the accident, was there something special about me? Something my father might have been trying to hide?" Sophia's expression darkened slightly, her hand tightening around her teacup. "There was," she admitted. "Your father. He was paranoid, always afraid someone would take you away. But there was one thing he always kept close, an old wooden box. He never let me see what was inside, but guarded it fiercely." Claire frowned. "What happened to it?" Sophia sighed. "After the accident, the box disappeared. I assumed it had been lost with him." Claire's mind raced. Could the box hold the key to her past? And if so, was it worth pursuing, even if it meant revisiting painful memories? Later that evening, she shared the story with Ethan, who listened intently. "If there's a chance that box could tell you more about who you are," he said, "I'll help you find it. Whatever it takes." Claire looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As they worked together to uncover the mystery of the wooden box, their bond grew even more potent. What began as a lie had transformed into a partnership built on trust, honesty, and an undeniable connection. But neither realized that the journey to uncover Claire's past would lead them to far more profound and life-changing answers than they could have imagined. Ethan and Claire's search for the mysterious wooden box began in earnest. Ethan leveraged his resources, hiring private investigators to track down leads about the accident and its aftermath. Meanwhile, Claire visited places from her fragmented memories, hoping to jog something that might lead her closer to the truth. One breakthrough came unexpectedly. An investigator found an older man named Frank, who had worked as a tow truck driver in the area where the accident occurred. Frank had vivid memories of the crash. It wasn't every day you encountered a wreck involving a high-profile family. "There was a box," Frank told them, his voice raspy but clear. "I remember pulling it from the wreckage before the fire consumed the car. The authorities didn't want it, so I kept it." Frank led them to his cluttered workshop, where he unearthed the wooden box. It was aged but intact, its brass lock tarnished from years of neglect. Claire stared at it, her heart pounding. This unassuming box held pieces of her past, fragments of a life she had been too young to understand. "Do you want to open it here?" Ethan asked gently. Claire shook her head. "No, I need to be somewhere safe." They returned to Ethan's penthouse, where Claire placed the box on the coffee table. She sat down, her hands trembling as she turned the key Frank had provided. With a soft click, the lock released, and Claire lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of items. Photographs of a smiling toddler, herself, held in Sophia's arms. Handwritten letters addressed to her father, filled with desperate pleas for reconciliation. And, most startling of all, a small ledger. Ethan picked up the ledger, flipping through its pages. His expression darkened. Claire, these are financial transactions. Large sums of money exchanged between your father and someone named Robert Calloway. Who's Robert Calloway? Claire asked, her voice wavering. Ethan's jaw tightened. He's a known figure in human trafficking. Claire's breath caught, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. Her father hadn't just been paranoid. He had been involved in something far darker, something that might have led to her abduction. Why would he do this? She whispered, tears welling. Sophia, who had joined them for the unboxing, placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. I never understood your father's actions, she said softly. But whatever mistakes he made, they don't define who you are. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. I need to know the truth, she said. Even if it's painful, I must understand why this happened. The investigation into Robert Calloway and her father's dealings consumed the next few weeks. Ethan worked tirelessly alongside Claire, using his connections to unearth hidden records and follow up on the leads in the ledger. What they uncovered painted a complicated picture. Claire's father had been coerced into his dealings with Calloway and blackmailed into paying for his family's safety. But when he tried to escape Calloway's grasp, tragedy struck, leading to the fatal crash. Though the truth was heartbreaking, it brought Claire a sense of clarity. Her father had made mistakes, but also tried to protect her. He wasn't a villain, she told Sophia one evening. He was a flawed man who made terrible choices. But in the end, he wanted me to be safe. Sophia nodded, tears in her eyes. And he succeeded. You're here. You're alive. And now, you can create the life he wanted for you. The discovery of the truth brought Claire and Sophia closer than ever, but it also deepened her bond with Ethan. His unwavering support, belief in her strength, and willingness to stand by her through every twist and turn had shown her a side of love she had never known. One quiet evening, Ethan turned to her as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city. Claire, or Sarah, if that's who you want to be, what do you want now? What does your future look like? She smiled, the weight of her past no longer suffocating her. I want to live, she said simply. To stop surviving and start building a life that's mine. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. And where do I fit into that life? Claire looked at him, her green eyes filled with gratitude and hope. I don't know what the future holds, she admitted, but I know I want you in it. Ethan's smile was genuine, his heart full. That's enough for me. 6 months later, Claire stood at the altar of a minor, sunlit chapel. She wore a simple but elegant gown, her hair cascading in soft waves. Beside her, Ethan looked at her with the same quiet admiration that had first drawn him to her. Sophia beamed from the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter start a new chapter. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by those who had been part of Claire's journey, those who had helped her find herself and her family. As Ethan and Claire exchanged vows, they weren't just promising a future together. They were honoring the trials they had endured, the truths they had uncovered, and the love that had transformed them both. What began as a lie had become a journey of healing, self-discovery, and redemption. And as they stepped into their new life together, they knew one thing for sure. The past no longer defined them. They could build a future filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities.